Our next speaker is Greg Moore, who has spoken to us before several years ago in his different capacity as a professor at Colorado Christian. He's now, of course, at Patrick Henry College, but he's still the same man who wrote an important book on Reinhold Niebuhr, the Christian philosopher, theologian, who is partly an inspiration for Providence Magazine. So, Greg, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. Can you guys hear me all right? I'm a little taller than some, but I think this is a good microphone and it will pick it up just fine. I'm presenting to you from a PowerPoint that is derived from a whole book. So you're not going to, if you want to hear the whole book, we'll be here till 8 p.m. But I won't give you the whole book. But I want to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about who Niebuhr was, and I'm going to talk a little bit about his articulation of what we've been calling Christian realism, and talk a little bit about what that looks like and how that's different from other schools of thought. And then I'm going to do kind of what I do in the book, which is I walk that thinking through several case studies that are today, issues of today. And I sort of try to bring Niebuhr into the 21st century. So it's kind of a what would Niebuhr say exercise. And of course, that opens me to criticism because some people would say he would never say that. But with Niebuhr, it's actually easy to do that because he said so many, his thinking is so nuanced and sometimes contradictory that I could always, I could almost make him say anything I want. So I'm not going to, if you pull 1930s Niebuhr and compare him to 1960s Niebuhr, they can be pretty different. But I came to Niebuhr, a little biographical sketch here. I was a graduate, a master's degree student at the University of Virginia. And I was actually an art major, so as my undergrad. So the Lord, I got saved right before going to grad school, and the Lord gave me this vision of international relations and blessed are the peacemakers and things like that. I don't know if that rings true for anybody in this room, but the Lord just spoke to me about the world and, that he so loved the world that he gave his own son. We all know that verse. And we usually think the world is, all the people that God wants to save. And that's true, but I think he loves the world, too. And he loves what's going on in the world. And there's things going on in this world that are more than just one-to-one evangelism. There's things like international relations, which then I've been doing really ever since then. And so when I got to this new graduate program in government and foreign affairs, coming from an art background, never having taken a political science course, really, and so my first semester, I had a great class with a brilliant professor, and I was walking across campus, and he came out and walked with me, and I kind of told him a little bit about my faith. He was a man of faith, probably more of a liberal faith than my own, but he was a church attender, and I said, so I'm a Christian, so I'm trying to understand how my faith, meshes with this discipline. And he said, well, you should read Niebuhr. And so that kind of began my journey reading Niebuhr, and I started doing that. And ended up writing my master's thesis on Niebuhr under the tutelage of Kenneth Thompson, who's kind of a legend in his own way. And then eventually this has become a book. So you just never know, even a master's degree thesis or maybe even an undergrad senior thesis someday could find its way into book form. So. If it's for God's glory, well, it will happen. So that's kind of how I came to Niebuhr. And actually, then I spent a total of about 14 years as a tent maker missionary in China. And it was actually while I was in China that I felt like the Lord. My doctoral dissertation was about China-U.S. relations, and I'm really a sinologist. That's what I do most of my work on. But I felt like God was saying, maybe because I was in China and I might get arrested if I said all that I wanted to say about China, so maybe God was telling me, why don't you take that master's thesis and work on that and make that a book? And probably because God knew he wanted me to work at Patrick Henry College someday where they would appreciate what I did on Niebuhr. Of course, the secular academy really didn't care a whole lot about Niebuhr, but I know folks like us do. So most of you probably are not familiar with Niebuhr. I'm guessing. How many of you have read Christ in Culture? You familiar with that? I'm actually surprised. I have one hand. Okay, first of all, that was not Reinhold Niebuhr. That was his brother. H. Richard Niebuhr. I'm actually surprised because, well, usually when I was at Colorado Christian, somebody there was assigning Christ in Culture, which is a great book, but his brother H. Richard was the theologian in the family, and Niebuhr always said, "I'm not a theologian, I'm an ethicist." And so I think that's right, actually. He didn't have a formal degree in theology, but almost all his work was about ethics. And so that's how I understand him. Let me just I'm going to read you one quote from Niebuhr that you all know, and I'm guessing most of you don't know it's him. And I was delighted to find in that little red bag, the first quote I'm going to read was a sticker in that bag, and I don't know if you noticed that. I hope if you looked past the Rice Krispies bar, there's a little sticker for your water bottle with Reinhold Niebuhr, and he says this: "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary." And I found that to be so true. Because of the, I believe, the imago Dei in us, there's potential in us to do good, to do amazing things. But because of the sinful nature that is also a part of who we are, democracy is necessary. And as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government possible, except for every other form of government. And that's something that Niebuhr really understood. The other quote I'm going to read is the one that I bet you know. And usually when I read this one, people are very surprised because they've heard it, but they didn't know it was him. It's a prayer. God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things that should be changed, and wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. How many have heard that before? Did you guys all go to Alcoholics Anonymous? I'm so surprised. I thought you knew Jesus. My goodness. No, that's an Alcoholics Anonymous prayer, actually. And so he wrote that in the 30s for Alcoholics Anonymous, and they adopted it, and it's been used by many people over time, and it's been a blessing to many people. It's a very wise prayer if you think about it. It's a prayer you can kind of pray every day after the Lord's Prayer if you do it. But so I'll start with talking about him. I don't look to Reinhold Niebuhr for his theology. There's some quirks in his theology. I don't look to him for his politics. He was a Democrat. I'm a Republican. But I do look to Niebuhr for his political philosophy, rooted as it is in a Christian worldview, and particularly in his Christian view of human nature. That's really where the strength of it is. I look to him also for his foreign policy prescription, rooted as it is in Christian realism. And I really do believe, I think it's fair to say he was the most brilliant mind this country produced in the 20th century. And if you read more of him, you'll see that. He was an academic. He spent a lot of time at Union Theological Seminary in New York, which is now so liberal as to maybe not be a seminary anymore. But at the time he was there, it was on more solid ground. He was Time Man of the Year 2 to 3 times. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He in some ways was a little bit like Billy Graham. I mean, he would be called to the White House or to the State Department to counsel people, to give them advice about foreign policy issues. There was even, in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt was trying to get him to run for president, and he declined. That was not his vision, but he would have run as a Democrat. I guess we can try to forgive him for that. I don't know, maybe there's some Democrats here, I should be careful. But George Kennan once said of Niebuhr, he is the father of us all, speaking about the realists of the post-war era, and I think that's true. So this realism that we talk about, I'm guessing most of the folks in this room, you've had realism, classical realism, structural realism, also known as neorealism. Then there's neoclassical realisms, which not everybody heard about, and that's okay because it's less important. But so he's a classical realist, but he's actually kind of different than the other classical realists because he's a human nature realist, and he takes the human nature factor very, very seriously. And so he believes that the world is driven not by structures or balance of power per se, but by the greed, fallibility, and will to power inherent to human nature itself. And he takes Scripture very seriously. I think he's a small Orthodox Christian in the sense of he starts from Scripture, and that's non-negotiable for him. So in his day, he was not a liberal Protestant. He was a conservative. I mean, he started out as a liberal Protestant, then he became a Marxist, and then he became a Christian realist, which is where he spent most of his career. There is a sort of a left side of his early work, which later sort of went away as the Cold War, as he saw how bad Stalin was, he let go most of that, I would say. And so actually in the last 20 years or so, there's been a bit of renaissance in Niebuhr, interest in Niebuhr. I think after 9/11, a lot of people realized evil's a real thing. You know, even on the left, the word evil was thrown around, which is really interesting if you think about the halls of academia. Everything is so secular and so material, and to hear the word evil thrown around, like this was really evil. They flew buildings in an airplane and killed thousands of innocent people. It is evil. For us, that's not a surprising thing to say, but it is surprising to hear it in the mainstream media. And so it's interesting. I remember at that time, a lot of people were talking about Niebuhr, like we need somebody like him actually to help us to understand this, because this is just evil. And liberalism and critical theory and constructivism or all these other isms, they're not really helping us to understand this. But what Niebuhr did really is a thing that can help you to understand, I think, these sorts of things. So Niebuhr starts with human nature. It's fundamental to all that he does, and you can't understand him without it. And so I would say, we've talked about Christian realism today. To my mind, I mean, Christian realism is broader than just IR, but if we're talking about international relations, Christian realism, it is Niebuhr. I mean, we can say maybe Paul Ramsey, some others, but mainly it's Niebuhr. He's the one who articulated this as a view that's taken seriously, I think, in international relations circles. And so he teaches human realism. When I teach human realism, I break it down into sort of three views. There's the kind of human nature is good, we're born good. And then it's things in the world that turn us bad. And then there's sort of a middle view where we're born neutral, sort of like a lump of clay. And then the world interacts with us. We have our own nature, we have the world, and then you get an outcome that could be good or bad depending on the environment. And then the view that Niebuhr embraced, and I hope all of us embrace, which is the biblical view, which is that humans are born sinful. From the fall on up, we are born sinful. Our tendency is to sin. You don't have to train a baby to be manipulative and narcissistic. That is how they come out. I'm a father. I've seen it. It's like a 3-month-old baby pounding his mommy's chest for milk. I didn't teach him that. I did not. And I had to remind my wife, no, that wasn't me. It could have been my genes, but it wasn't me. That's just the way we are. And so that's how Niebuhr viewed human beings. We're sinful. We're self-interested. We tend to get what we want and to work to get what we want. And so if we build a political system that doesn't take that into account, we're going to be very sorry. And so the founders got that right. I think the American founders understood that, and that was the view of human nature that they shared. So that is where you have to start with Christian realism, and that's where you have to start with Niebuhr. Interestingly, I've found that in social science and in international relations theory, realism, or I should say human nature, has kind of made a return, actually. There's Rosen and even Wendt, Alexander Wendt, and some others, social psychology meets IR. There's a lot of people thinking about human nature, and so it's kind of made a bit of a return in the last few years. So you start with individuals. They are sinful. Okay. The next thing, we move up one level to sort of collective life. So Niebuhr starts with individualism. He would say turn the other cheek is viable as an individual. You know, if you decide that somebody treats you badly and you want to turn the other cheek, that's an option for you. Because it would, if there is a cost to that, if they then literally slap you on the other cheek, that's your cost to bear. But Niebuhr would say that's not an option necessarily if you're acting on behalf of someone else. So he begins to build a kind of moral dualism, which is, some people really don't like it, and I understand that. But he says, when you are I read a book by John Howard Yoder called The Politics of Jesus. Anybody familiar with that book? I would say it's a brilliant book. It doesn't work, but it's a brilliant book. And I read this book. He's an Anabaptist thinker. He's passed away now, from the University of Notre Dame back in the day. And it's a brilliant treatise on what pacifism looks like socially. And it's beautiful. You read it, it's beautiful. And so I was telling my wife about it, and she looked at me kind of funny. That my wife's really a realist at heart. And she said, so you're telling me that if we're walking around downtown in the city there, and a mugger jumps out and knocks me to the ground and starts beating me, you're going to stand there and say Jesus loves you and do nothing? And that was the end of my pacifism. No, I'm going to jump on him. I'm going to pound his head until he gets off, and then I'm going to call the police, and I'm going to pin him while you call the police. Of course, I'm a husband, and if I had kids, I would defend my children. If I was a pastor, that makes me a shepherd. I'm going to defend my flock. And if I'm the President of the United States, I'm going to defend my country, because that's my job. And if I'm a policeman, Romans 13 gives me the right to bear the sword. That's all biblical. Pacifism, it seems to me, is an option for an individual, but I don't think it is an option for a leader who has responsibility over a group. So what Niebuhr began to see was that for groups, another dimension of this is what he called group egoism. It's another reason pacifism in group dynamics doesn't really work very well, because while you might expect good behavior from time to time, maybe from individuals, if they know Jesus, it becomes a little more likely. But even Christians are sinners too, I think we all know that. But groups are much harder to find, to expect good behavior from, because to be a member of a group means there's kind of a social cohesion that's necessary for the group to survive. And so if you become a critic of the group tends to kind of turn against you, that it's not just about you have a different idea, it's that you're against the group. You're not with us. You're not a team player, in the workplace. You got to be careful about that. If you're a Christian, be careful. Your faith might be viewed that way. And so being divisive, having a different view, holding them accountable in your own group becomes very difficult, because it's a threat to cohesion. And so groups are more chauvinistic than individuals, is the picture that he paints. And he has a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And that's what he means. He means that humans, he later said he should have called it Immoral Man and Even More Immoral Society, which probably would have been a better title, but not quite as snappy. And so I think he's right about that. Moving from sort of the collective to the IR then, of course, you cannot then expect that when you're dealing with another power, another country who has nuclear weapons, who has tanks, guns, soldiers, you can't, Neville Chamberlain is the classic example, that I think Eric talked about yesterday. Eric Patterson was a great example. Peace in our time, it wasn't, was it? I mean, he went home, he thought he did something heroic, and I believe he believed that. He believed that. He wasn't stupid, but he was wrong, but he sincerely believed that was going to be a good thing, to make a deal with Hitler to avoid a war. Well, in fact, Niebuhr talked a lot about that, and he said that's a perfect example of good intentions used in the wrong way. If you have a different view of human nature and you realize that Hitler was building a very powerful military and a very strong political machine, so that he had resources, capabilities, as realists like to talk about, that you can't trust him. Even if you think you do trust him, you'd be safer to not trust him and to, as Reagan said, maybe trust but verify at best. And so he decided that was a very immoral policy. Seeking peace turned out to be immoral. That sounds very strange, doesn't it? But I think it's absolutely true. That desire for peace that Neville Chamberlain had, he desired it so badly that he set up a situation that led to the deaths of 6 million Jews and 20 million Russians and millions of others, including Americans, Brits, French, and Italians, and Africans, and it became a huge world war because of a misplaced desire to have peace at any cost. And Niebuhr would have pointed out that that's not the way to view human nature. It's not the way to do foreign policy. And so we need to remember that today. I would argue, in my book, I argue that Niebuhr would have been a supporter. Now, this will be controversial to some, but then I would say if you've read all the Niebuhr stuff I've had, then I'll have a conversation with you. I've read a lot of really obscure things that he wrote. It's really hard to find things that he wrote, which is actually why I wrote this book, because I tried to pull together all the disparate little articles in Christian Century and the Atlantic and all these little things he wrote from the 30s through the early 70s about foreign policy and politics. And I think this is right, that I think what we know as R2P today, responsibility to protect, he would have been a cautious supporter of that. I think in 1931, when China invaded Japan, Japan invaded China, his brother wrote an article called "The Grace of Doing Nothing," saying, we know this is wrong, but in the name of Jesus, we're not going to do anything about it. And Niebuhr, already that early in the early 30s, he thought that was wrong. He said, we have a moral responsibility. And I have a great quote about this. This is partly about why he's not a pacifist, but it's also about his response to this idea of the grace of doing nothing. And I think my little bookmark just fell out, so let's see if I can still find it or not. Let's see here. Yes, here it is. He says, when a great fire has broken out in a small town, responsible citizens who are in a position to do something about it do not draw their shutters, lock their doors, and crawl under their beds. To do so would be to forget forever moral authority in their community. The Christian ethic requires these citizens to go out on the street and do whatever may be necessary to help their fellows bring the fire under control. And so he argued that the U.S. should do something to help the Chinese people. In the same way, towards the late 30s, when the U.S. Was continued to be in an isolationist foreign policy orientation, and Hitler began, attacking the UK. They invaded, Czechoslovakia, France. They started bombing the UK, and the U.S. was in a position of neutrality. And then eventually we had like this Lend-Lease thing. Okay, we'll give you some supplies, but we're still not coming to your aid, Britain. And he just thought that was immoral. He just thought, these are people who need our help. And he would talk, the Good Samaritan. There's an example of somebody needed help. There's a cost to helping. You could put yourself in danger. But to not help is to not love, would be his argument. So sometimes to use force is an act of love, is the right thing, the responsible thing to do. I'd be happy to talk more about. He has a lot of examples of foreign policy episodes where he thought the great powers should have intervened and they did not. One, he was also a great Zionist. This may not be well known about him, but he was very active in the World Council of Churches after the war to help the Jewish people get a homeland. And that's something I love about him, because I think that was maybe one of the greatest things he ever did. He worked very hard to push the English and the Americans to support an Israeli homeland. He was also, another very little known thing about him, he helped Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family raise money after the war to support themselves after Dietrich Bonhoeffer died. As you know the story, he wrote, Bonhoeffer was a pastor who thought Hitler was wrong and stood up against Hitler, and then participated in an assassination attempt against Hitler, was arrested and died in prison. And so Niebuhr raised money for people like him, pastors, specifically him, and some others, to care for their families after the war. I argue, another point I would make about Niebuhr is that I would say Niebuhr is in the just war tradition. And I know a friend of mine, Keith Pavlicek, and some others would say, no, it's not. It's not just war. There's a consequentialism in Niebuhr's work, which is there, and I understand that. But I was saying in the beginning that Niebuhr was an ethicist. And so everything he did was about ethics, about doing the right thing. So when it comes to jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war, just cause, he wrote a lot about that. And he thought very deeply about that. So the one where he's maybe a little more open to criticism is in his Jus in Bello. He didn't write as much about that. But he also wrote about that. He was against the Dresden firebombing. He was against against the Dresden bombing and against the Tokyo firebombing. He thought that was immoral. He was initially against the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Later, he came to peace, maybe an uneasy peace with nuclear weapons, but he had a lot of very nuanced things to say about the weight of it, as we've heard some discussion today. I'm with Rebecca on the issue today. I just think we need to build up our nuclear weapons, and we can talk more about that. I think Niebuhr would agree if he was here today. I argue in the book that I think he would have been against the Iraq War. He was against the Vietnam War. he was one of the few actually most of the realists were against the Iraq War. We usually think they're a bunch of hawks, but they're very prudent in their foreign policy proscriptions. And so, like the other realists of the day, Niebuhr came out against the Vietnam War. He said it was not in our national interest. It was not a vital national interest. We were not attacked by Vietnam. And this was a war of nationalism, of really independence from French colonial rule. And then now the Americans have kind of replaced the French. And so it's really, to the French, to the Vietnamese, that's really what the war is about. It's not so much a part of the Cold War as we were making it out to be, and we can disagree about that. But he believed that I argue that I think, contrary to what Gene Elshtain and some others have argued, that I do not think that was a just war. I think the war on terror was just, because we'd been attacked, and Afghanistan was the place the attack came from, and so I think that was a legitimate enterprise to undertake. But I never thought that the war against Iraq was justified. I think the war in Afghanistan was justified for that same reason, but not for the war in Iraq. We can talk more about that if you're interested. I'm a Sinologist. I write about China, so I have a whole chapter in the book about what would Niebuhr say about the rise of China. And to me, I think he actually wrote about China. And he talked about how difficult it would be for democracy to ever stick there. He said some very, very wise things, which, as somebody who's lived there for 14 years and who's written about it, been studying it and writing about it for 30 years, he was brilliant. I mean, he reached some conclusions, with much less data, that I thought were really, really good conclusions. I think he would be very, very hawkish about the rise of China today, for the same reason that he was hawkish towards the Soviet Union. It's a dictatorship. It's a monopoly on power. An amazing ability to control people's ideas and to shape people's thinking. The growth of power would concern him, as it would any realist. The master narrative of China today is the century of humiliation, that they're a victim, and this kind of narrative. And so the party is what has to stand up for the people, and the foreigners are the problem. And this is really a narrative that is potentially very dangerous. It makes China a very prickly interlocutor if you're trying to deal with them, a partner in any sort of thing that we try to do internationally. It makes China a very, very difficult country to work with. And I think also just human nature. Xi Jinping has almost total power now. I have an article that I've been floating around. It's been rejected so far. If anybody wants to read it and give me feedback, I'd be happy to share it with you, where I'm making the case that China really should be called totalitarian. And I'm going back to Hannah Arendt and the debates from the 50s about what totalitarianism is. And totalitarianism has kind of gone away from our discussions, but I think we have to bring it back, because China is totalitarian in a 21st century way that really was different than the 30s. It's a different kind of totalitarianism, and that's human nature. Humans are sinful, and Xi Jinping is unrestrained in his country, and he's quite unrestrained in many respects outside of his country if we don't stand up for deterrence, as Rebecca was saying. It's a really important message. We need to remember what deterrence is, and we need to think about what we can do to deter China, because if we don't, there's nobody else who will. So in conclusion, I just think Niebuhr would have a lot to say about where we are right now. I think he would not be a fan of Trump. He was a Democrat, but he didn't like John F. Kennedy. He didn't vote for Kennedy. He thought he was too. He didn't like his womanizing. He didn't like some of those moral issues about John F. Kennedy, even though Kennedy was a great Democrat, I suppose, for the Democrats. In the same way, I think he would have warned us about some things that we see with Trump. Though I guess as a very reluctant supporter of Trump, I would say, well, Mr. Niebuhr, what options do we have? Where are we going to turn for conservative policies that have a chance of being reasonable and good for our country? I think he would have had some interesting words about the post-truth era and about the dangers of hubris and those sorts of things, which he wrote a lot about. So I encourage you, students, if you have not read Niebuhr, just a short book you could go to is The Irony of American History. That's a good little introductory book that Niebuhr wrote about U.S. foreign policy. You get a little taste of him. You could read Moral Man in a Moral Society. It was written in the 30s, so it's a little bit more of the leftist Niebuhr, but also very insightful in many ways. If you really want to go deep, read Nature and Destiny of Man, both volumes. You should probably reserve 2 or 3 months for that, but it is a great book. Or you could flip through the book that I wrote, which would take a lot less time for you probably, and you might learn. But he's really someone that we should continue to learn from. Even though I think most of us are more conservative politically and theologically than him, there's a lot to appreciate about Niebuhr, and I commend him to you. So I think I'll just stop there and see if there are any questions from the audience. I'm just curious, has anybody ever read anything by Niebuhr? The IRD guys are all raising their hands, but some of the students have. Okay, good. Happy to talk about China. Happy to talk about nuclear weapons. I usually give talks about China. You're the only people who are interested in Niebuhr, because if I go out there into the regular world, they don't really care too much about him because he's a Christian, and that's like feudalism. We don't need any of that. Unfortunately, that's the view some people have.
Hello, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm Rosemary from Liberty, and I just wondered, when I read about thinkers, I always try to read side by side with someone who thinks opposite of what they do. Do you have any people that come to mind whom I could do that with Niebuhr, an opposite thinker, someone who sees things from the other side?
John Howard Yoder, the Politics of Jesus, that would be the book that comes to my mind. So he presents the Anabaptist tradition, the pacifist tradition. It's the best articulation of that position. But to me, it's completely wrong. And Neville Chamberlain is what you get. But it's a good read. And to me, juxtaposing Niebuhr and Yoder is really an interesting thing. And I've had a class on just war, and I make them read both Niebuhr and Yoder, and it's a really great discussion. Yeah. Good question. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Faith from Asbury Theological Seminary. I'm studying ethics, so I'm pretty familiar with Niebuhr. I was actually just having this conversation with my professor about Yoder and how recent things have come out about some moral failings on his part, and not that this necessarily correlates with Niebuhr, but I'd love to hear your opinion on a conversation that I tend to have a lot with my colleagues on how do you reconcile some really great written works, especially that are theologically based and have to do with ethics, and then years down the road, even past their death, things come out about them that are horrendous. How do you hold those two in tension?
Can I ask? So this is interesting. So I'm not aware of any specific moral failings. The only one that I can think of is possibly that he plagiarized using his wife's work. His wife was a British woman of great intellect who was also a professor and proofread everything he ever wrote. And he grew up speaking German in the home, so his English was never that great. And he really never gave her credit until towards the very end. And so to me, that's kind of a moral failing. But that's the only thing I know about. What are you alluding to?
Talking about Yoder, not Niebuhr.
Oh, Yoder.
Yes.
Oh, I'm not surprised. I had an interaction with Yoder, kind of funny. I was at a, it was the Pew, Keith Pavlicek and Ron Sider used to run the Crossroads program, and I was a fellow. So it was in St. David's, Pennsylvania, I think, and they picked us up at the airport, and I was in the van with John Howard Yoder, and I was interested to meet him because I knew his book, and I asked him, and I said, I'm kind of a Niebuhr guy, and he was violently opposed. I mean, literally, like, very, very aggressive. And I thought, you're the pacifist guy, but you're one of the most aggressive people I've ever met. And but another an example that's maybe more famous is Martin Luther King Jr., right? I mean, I just think so highly of him, but he had some issues, didn't he? I mean, we know about that. So I guess Niebuhr has some insight. He would say, well, we shouldn't be so surprised. They're sinners and they're human, but that doesn't mean God can't still use them for great things. And so I guess to me then, what kind of a man was he, whether we're talking about King or whether we're talking about Yoder? Did they repent? Did they allow themselves to be held accountable by their church, by their family? That's how I'd like to see. I'd like to know, and I don't know. In either case, I don't really know any details about those things. If they are held accountable, then they're my brother, and I would think we extend grace to them like we would hope others would extend to ourselves. I guess that's my best answer. Yeah. Anyone else have a question? I think I saw another hand. Yes, there's a hand over there behind the pillar. I don't know.
Randall Fowler, Assistant Professor of Political Rhetoric at Abilene Christian University. What do you think Niebuhr would make? What do you think Niebuhr would make of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iran from 1978 until about now?
That's a good question. I don't remember him writing about, he died in 71, so it was 79 when we had the revolution right in Iran. So Iran was not at the top of the agenda really during those years because they were kind of in our pocket. They had the Shah and they were big oil producing country and we were pretty friendly with them. I'm trying to think, what would he say today? I suspect that he would have been somewhat in the same league of thinking as Trump has been, and he would say, you are really naive if you think this kind of a deal is going to make the Iranians follow the rules and that they're going to keep their promises, and that's really naive. So I think he probably wouldn't have gone along with the Obama administration making those accords. I think he would have said, I would, as a human nature realist, as a Christian realist, I would expect they're going to cheat. And they have. And so I guess that would be my insight if I was trying to understand what he might have said. I think that's where he would come down. Yeah. I guess the thing I would say about Niebuhr is that he's not always pessimistic. Realists tend to be viewed in a very pessimistic way because they have this dark view of human nature. But that's something that's different about Niebuhr from other realists. The Christian part of Christian realism brings there's room for some hope. There's a transcendent potential there, just as it is in each of our testimonies, right? Who we were, that we became Christians, and who we've become. We're still sinners. Ask our spouses or our roommates. We haven't arrived, and we won't until we're sitting with him on the other side. But we're better than we were, I would venture to say. And I think so for Niebuhr, when the glory of God and the potential that Christ brings to each individual soul who is transformed and regenerated, there's a potential there for good, for hope, for beauty that is much bigger than any regular secular kind of realist or other thinker is going to account for. And so that's something that I also find kind of inspiring. And that's one of the reasons you see it seems like a contradiction. He's so realistic about human nature and the darkness and people like Hitler and the folly of Neville Chamberlain. But there's other times when you see there's a kind of hope there that sounds surprising that Niebuhr would say something like that. And I think that's where that comes from. And I find that kind of beautiful, kind of reassuring. Cautiously optimistic, trusting but verifying, but in Christ all things are possible, and that's something that I like about Niebuhr that I find there that I don't find in other thinkers. There's another question if you got time for one more.
And forgive me if I'm getting this incorrect, based off of vague recollections from high school and a quick Google search right now. Niebuhr was someone who was very much for humility and kind of pushed back on some ideas. I wouldn't say he pushed back on American exceptionalism, but he wanted to make sure the United States approached foreign policy with a more humble air than perhaps in the past.
Right.
So you mentioned you're a conservative. So in the past couple years, Donald Trump and the Republican Party has started to try to bring back some American resurgence, American pride, try to take a little bit more of like, we're going to do this and y'all are going to
Right.
maybe deal with it a little bit. So what do you think his take would be on the modern political climate? I mean, I know you mentioned he probably wouldn't like Donald Trump very much, but as a conservative, how do you take his humility and his approach to that, and Christianity's call for humility, and the kind of resurgence in pride in American politics right now, and bring those two together into something that's kind of cohesive and works together and invests in American interests while not being arrogant?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's a good way to end this discussion, too, because I really wish Donald Trump would read Niebuhr, because I think Donald Trump has some brilliant political interests, political instincts, I should say. He's got some brilliant political instincts, but there's a narcissistic sort of trend there that's very, very dangerous in my mind when it comes to Donald Trump, and that's exactly the kind of stuff that Niebuhr, his radar was really attuned to that, and he said that's dangerous, and I personally think that's very dangerous about Donald Trump. But then again, I just, like, I saw that assassination attempt this summer, and I just thought, that's God. I mean, I can't believe he just turned his head and the bullet went right by, and I just couldn't help but thinking, at that point, I wasn't sure I was still going to vote for him, but the way I think I saw a little humanity and humility in Trump that actually helped change my mind a little bit and decide to vote for him. And I think that God uses broken people, and Trump's a broken person. Some of his brokenness is a little more evident than it is with others. I'm being very understated in how I'm saying that. But I think he has great political instincts, and I think he does have conservative values for the most part. But I think he needs some of that wisdom of somebody like Reinhold Niebuhr just to restrain the prudence. Prudence is a term that realists use a lot, and it's a really good one, like being cautious, just kind of treading carefully where angels fear to tread, walking carefully. When you're the president of the United States and you've got nuclear weapons at your disposal, and you've got the National Guard, and you've got the bully pulpit, you really need humility. And I do see, maybe I'm hoping that maybe Trump has some room to grow in that area, but it's a political moment right now that probably needs somebody like Niebuhr to speak into, and I hope that we find some of that wisdom, and it's kind of hard to find these days, it seems to me. So, thank you for the question.